But it's certainly like.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me, and hopefully everybody at home can hear me. It's absolutely wonderful to see you all here. Wonderful to have such a full lecture theatre today, and it's very exciting to be part of this collaboration between the three organisations. I know Gavin's going to speak to a little bit to that in a few minutes, but it's a real honour to be part of this, and we're delighted to have been invited. My name's Simon Thompson. I'm the Chief Executive here at the Geological Society, which is we're the hosts for this part of the evening, so I get a couple of minutes to give you a very brief introduction to the Geological Society, hopefully without hesitation, deviation, or repetition. The Geological Society is a learned and professional society. We provide professional and academic accreditation. We provide professional support in the form of scientific publishing and conferences, and we support schools and families to help educate and inspire the next generation. And with regard to policy, we are a national forum for the debate and development of cutting-edge earth science. We have a special responsibility to communicate this science to society, the government, the media, other scientific communities, and the general public. Our policy work aims to communicate technical geoscience information as and where it relates to public policy, and to raise awareness of geoscience considerations in UK policymaking. In developing our policy work, we're keen to encourage the input of as many geoscientists as possible to provide a range of perspectives and expertise relevant to the issue at hand. If you'd like to know more about how you can get involved with the Geological Society, and in particular our policy work, you can contact us at, it's a very easy email address to remember. It's policy@geolsoc.org.uk, or you can speak with the team. Katie Jones, who's here over at the back, or Megan O'Donnell. I look forward to seeing more of you in person later on. Without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's great for us at the Foundation for Science and Technology to be doing this event in partnership with Simon and the Geological Society. Thank you very much for your hospitality here this evening. And also, we very much look forward afterwards to going to the Royal Society of Chemistry, where there'll be a reception just around the corner inside Birmingham House through the main entrance. And a warm welcome to this event. Critical minerals, how can science and technology help deliver the UK strategy? The strategy, of course, was published back in 2022 and is even more topical now. Events in Ukraine and President Trump's discovery of the value of Ukraine's critical minerals shows just what a significant force this has become in the world stage. We'll explore the UK strategy, how science, technology, and innovation can help deliver it. We've got four excellent speakers. We'll start with Professor Paul Monks. Professor Paul Monks, CB, because he was awarded the Companion of the Order of the Bath in the King's New Year's Honours, for which many congratulations, Paul. Paul was Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Head of the College of Science and Engineering at the University of Leicester, and still has a link to Leicester. But he is here as the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to just do the sort of critical minerals 101. I'm going to set the scene, and then you've got the people who really know the stuff going to come up and talk about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the critical minerals strategy and the role of science and technology as part of that. Critical minerals, semiconductors, and data are the oil, steel, and electricity of the 21st century. I think that is their importance. They are the next industrial revolution as part of this. As we decarbonize, as our society changes, they become more important as part of that. I didn't say that, Lord Sedwell said that as part of that. And you can see this on this next slide here. You can see on the left-hand side a whole bunch of critical minerals listed in small type so you can't read them. In the middle, you'll see all sorts of technologies that may use those minerals. And I think it's worth just, a lot of talk in the media, and we tend to think that this is just about batteries or wind farms. There's not. There's a lot of technology that has a lot of minerals in it. I'll come back to that in a minute. Absolutely, it drives the move to renewables. Also, the moves to electric mobility as part of that, but also implicit in areas such as defence and space around that. So it's a strategically important sector, it's rapidly growing, and it's changing. This is some data from the IEA that shows that this very same thing. This is the average amount of minerals in a vehicle here, an electric car. So an average electric car contains over 200 kilograms per vehicle, whereas a conventional car contains slightly less than 50. The statistic I always use is that an electric car has 11 kilometers of copper wire in it, compared to 1 kilometer of copper wire in a conventional car. So that really shows the real difference that you get with these sort of technologies. You can also see as we move to different technologies at the bottom in terms of onshore, offshore wind, solar, nuclear. And the incumbent technology is not any longer in the UK coal, because we closed our last coal-fired power station on September the 31st last year at 5:30 p.m. Just in case you wondered, around that, and also natural gas at the bottom. But what you can see is, the kilograms per megawatt of power produced there, significantly more critical minerals or minerals in general around that. We'll get to why I keep calling them critical minerals and then correcting myself at the next step around this. When is a mineral critical and when isn't it critical? That's going to be what Gavin's going to tell you all about. I think it's worth thinking a little bit about the global geopolitical picture that David alluded to in the start here. These minerals are produced in a range of different countries around the world. And this is just a few kind of picked out for 2019 around that. And you'll see a preponderance and you'll see a difference in where those minerals come from. You'll see also what the number of those minerals are and some of the uses that they're put to. But it'd be wrong to think about the story of minerals and critical minerals as a story only about primary production. Only where do those minerals come from? Where is that ore loading body, or whatever the geological phrase is, he says at the Royal Geological Society, around that? Because actually they travel, they move quite a lot. This is just a kind of a cartoon. If you think about the midstream, they might be mined in one country, but they're refined into a concentrate in a different country, and they're packaged often into a final product in a third country. So we talk a lot about the value chain for these minerals and the way that they move around the globe as part of that. And you can see here that they move, this is kind of the batteries around that, and there's a midstream. Why are they critical? But if you look at the extraction picture and the refining picture and the countries that they come from, I think it tells a story that most people are probably aware of in this room. So on the left-hand side is a number of the minerals that are very important, the rare earths in magnets, lithium, cobalt, nickel, in batteries, copper I've already mentioned. And just interestingly, at the bottom of it, which I love this graph, here is the current kind of incumbent natural gas and oil extraction at the bottom. And what you'll see is there's a markedly different picture in the extraction and processing for the incumbent technologies of gas and oil vis-a-vis the minerals. Geologically, geopolitically, geographically, they're different. But also you'll see this value chain that we talk about, where you extract the minerals and where you process them, is also very markedly different around the globe. So David said we produced a strategy in 2022, recognition really that we needed resilience for the future, given that picture that I've just talked about. We put together the first UK's critical mineral strategy. That strategy is ACE. I won't name the government minister who David knows very well, whose idea that was. Anyway, I won't. He said we must, there's a clue. He said we must accelerate the growth of the UK's domestic markets. We must collaborate with international partners, and we must enhance international markets to make them more responsible. We brought two things into existence at the time to deliver that strategy. We convened a critical minerals expert committee, and a number of people in this room who I recognise are members of that committee. And it's a really good committee. It's one of the best expert committees I've worked with, because there's a real mixture of academia, industry, economists, producers, midstream financiers. We get a real kind of really picture, and you get a real sense that the UK is a place where a lot of that critical thinking is going on about minerals and their use. We also, at that time, the first strategy in 2022, founded the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre to really continuously monitor those supply chains and project the future supply and demand. And Gavin, who's the current head of that, will talk a little bit more about that. The core of this question of criticality is quite important, and it really looks at the UK economic vulnerability with respect to the supply of minerals versus the global supply. The challenges of criticality assessments, again, Gavin can talk to, as they look backwards around that, and the challenges to project forward for that. This is the currently, is it 2025 or 2024? The late 24 assessment that came out of those 34 minerals, which was an increase from the 18 or 20 in the first strategy that came out there around that, reflecting, I think, a changing situation of the criticality of these minerals, but also the assessment of where they're used in the UK supply chain as part of that. Just to pause on the ACE strategy for a second, before I then tell you we're about to change it, as is government's way with these sort of things, I think it's worth just looking at the kind of 10 or so things that were in that, which were important kind of headlines around that. Domestic production, skills, R&D and circular economy, recognising in the UK we do have a limited supply of some of those minerals, but also we have a lot of the knowledge of skills. We have a lot of the top world R&D in this area, and actually we're pushing very hard on circularity as part of that. We want to collaborate to diversify supply chains with the UK companies operating overseas, and that diplomatic and trading and development relationships. Actually, our SCDO, and I've worked with them, are really great global partners out there working with British industry in those supplier countries, on those processing countries, in order to collaborate with that. But there's also been a recognition that we must do that responsibly. We must do that responsibly in the way that we operate, with the highest ESG standards. This is a sector that has had a checkered history with respect to this, and actually many consumers are now pushing really hard to remove some of that. But, you know, nobody wants small children mining minerals in countries in their motor vehicle around that. So there's a big push around that. And also responsible finance. London, and the market in London is one of the largest mining finance markets, capital markets in the world. We have had a number of successes for that. The National Wealth Fund has put 28 million recently into Cornish Metals facility. And the UK Infrastructure Bank has put equity investment of around 24 million into Cornish Lithium. There are new companies like Green Lithium in the northeast opening up, as well as incumbent companies such as Pensana and Rare Earths, who are doing some of the reprocessing and processing of those rare earth magnets, as well as highly innovative companies in the UK like Hypermag, who are pioneering hydrogen recycling of rare earth magnets from disk drives in your computer around that as well. So there's great innovation, but there's also that scale up and investment in that. I said that we've done a lot around the innovation and the R&D, and you can begin to see that in terms of of research projects like the one I've chosen here, which is on climate, which is looking at this question of how to build a more sustainable supply chain, particularly in the rare earths around that, spending significant R&D capital in order to deliver that. I think a real strength of the UK is its international partnerships. We are, I feel, very much seen in the international sphere as a fair broker in many of this. And there are many countries, when I've been on international missions around that, who want to talk to the UK, particularly because they want to access our skills and our R&D around that. And we have a number of bilateral agreements that we've signed as part of that are listed on the screen there, as well as working through a number of multilateral engagements, some of which I think, David, are changing as we speak around that. The Mineral Security Partnership was led very heavily out of the US. I think we await to find out what will happen to something like that. So we did the last strategy in 2022, so it was really mainly written in 2021 and published in 2022. And the new government has come in and this is not government policy, it's subject to change. A strategy develops around this. I think that the subby's put on there. We're really thinking now about a new strategy. And really, the ministers are pushing us hard to have an ambitious strategy to help kickstart that economic growth, support the industries of tomorrow, more targeted, effective, fewer interventions that will grow our strength, and that articulate an impact on people's lives working through business and capitalizes on that economic growth piece. I call this picture the Wheel of Fortune around this, but this is the Wheel of Fortune. And what we're doing, we're talking to people now really about how to build that new critical mineral strategy. You'll see some of the same flavors: producing more, recycling or circularizing more, getting that supply signal and clear demand, and making sure industry is aware of that need, growing our international partnerships, using the City of London as a centre of mining finance. It's not only the big banks are here, the London Metal Exchange is here as well, but also always wrapped in that very clear, responsible and transparent supply chain framing, which is important to this. So hopefully in my very brief introduction, I've given you a flavour of the imperative around minerals in the changing world. As we decarbonise, they become more important as we shift. They're globally very mobile. They come out of the ground a lot, but in fact, they're midstream that move. And we need a strategy that does bring all these different elements that are on this screen here in order to deliver the safety, security, and the economic growth in this area. Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I can report, actually, I happened to by chance be in a meeting this morning with hard-bitten officials involved in the National Infrastructure Bank, the National Wealth Fund, who are very proud of their investments in the Cornish lithium mine and the Cornish tin industry. So the critical minerals message is getting across. Before we come to our next speaker, I should just also welcome our online participants. And you should have there on the number, the way to access questions, put questions on Slido so that we can assess your questions at the Q&A session, as well as interventions from people here in the room. Our next speaker is Dr. Gavin Mudd, who joined the British Geological Survey in 2023 as the director of the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre. He is a formidable scholar on sustainable mining and critical minerals. And I love this. His experience includes how we mine and use almost the entire periodic table. That is fantastic. Over to you.
G'day. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a long way from Australia. And often the question I get, one of the first questions is like, why? Australia is a mining powerhouse. Why would you come to the UK? And I think, well, isn't it obvious? The opportunities here and the ability to contribute to the change that's going on in the world. I can do a lot more here than I can in Australia. We have to solve problems like circularity. We have to deal with some of the technologies and all the other issues. So for me, it's a great opportunity. And I was very happy to be able to come across and join the British Geological Survey. This is going to be really quick. So I'll add a lot more detail to some of the things that sort of Paul's already laid out there. The details in our reports. So they're available on our website. You can see the link there. But so please go and read them. And we're happy to take some questions either tonight or follow up and go from there. But I want to really talk through the criticality assessment and some of the issues and the sort of, the things we do there. And then also some of the work we're just starting to release now in terms of the foresight work that's been led by my colleagues, Dr. Evi Petervrazzi and Dr. Stefan Horn and others. Just first of all, why do we exist? Well, we exist to help. Our primary purpose is to help the UK government achieve what we need to do around critical minerals. And I think there's a recognition that critical minerals, it's not just about clean energy, it's about all sorts of other sectors. And I'll come back to that because before I started, of course, a few years ago when the last criticality assessment was done in 2021, there was only 26 elements actually assessed, and they were largely ones associated with decarbonisation. So we've broadened that out, but our job is to look at everything related to critical minerals, because largely we're talking about risk management. We're worried about the risk of not having niobium or not having lithium, all the other different metals, minerals. Helium is a material, so we always have this existential torment about what sort of language we use, but we're essentially talking about risk management. All right, making sure that we understand the risks, and we can actually make decisions accordingly. So Paul sort of touched on this, but not only are we needing a more complex range of metals and minerals and materials, we need more of them. All right, our technology is evolving. We've got lots of different things that we do. Often the first thing we pick up these days is a phone or maybe a tablet, and that's how we engage with the world. All right, so I think we need to understand what's happening with that technology. If we look at a mobile phone, one of the bizarre facts that I always love is if you take your smartphone in your hand, 70% of the value in this phone is actually gold. All right, and that's what pays for things like recycling or the circular economy. So, because when we're thinking about the circular economy or the different supplies and so on, there's lots of different examples there. So if we could look at cobalt in the early or late 1970s, early 1980s, basically continuing rounds of civil unrest started occurring in the Congo, basically flattened cobalt supply. So the aerospace industry, that's too expensive, so they substituted. And they got out of cobalt and used other alloys instead. And of course, now Congo got back to sort of stability and the cobalt supply was normalized. Many years ago, of course, just over a decade ago, there was the Matacana riots in South Africa. And there's always concern in the criticality space. What happens if we don't have platinum group elements? If we don't, then of course our cars that rely on them in the catalytic converters and the exhaust pipes, we'd be setting ourselves back decades in terms of air quality in cities. And so we can see that despite the Matacana riots, it really didn't affect the platinum price, which is interesting. It's one of the things that I think we often overestimate is sometimes we expect, sort of really bad impacts on price or things like that, but not always, often difficult. Of course, then you get rare earths and China in 2010, and that did send the rare earths price absolutely skyrocketing. So, so the way we try and integrate all of these different types of examples is to think about supply risk. These are outlined in more detail in both in our methodology report, which was done before I joined, and then as we're working through the criticality assessment, we've evolved some things to sort of make some tweaks to the way the methodology works. But first and foremost, we look at production. Where are the mines? Because this is a raw material assessment. What's the primary raw materials that the UK needs for all of its technologies? So that production concentration, I get this right, up the top here, right? That's looking at the source countries as Paul showed, and we'll come back to that. Then we've looked at global trade. Where are the biggest net importers? All right, that's important because people who control the import flows can also exert influence over supply chain, so that's important. We also look at companionality. All right, if you take a smartphone, laptop or iPad, whatever, the screen only works because of an element called indium, which most people have probably never heard of, but that's what gives us the color, indium tin oxide. So you can't mine indium, you only have to extract that. You have to process, say, zinc, maybe some tin or some lead, but at the moment, mostly we get indium from zinc refining. So we call that a companion metal. It's always present with something else. And so for many elements across the periodic table, we can only get them by mining copper first, or mining gold first, or mining zinc first. And then in the process of running a smelter or refinery, we can then extract things like tellurium or a whole range of other elements there. So we need to account for that because that helps us understand the supply risk. And then, of course, recycling rate, so end-of-life collection rate. And that's something we've got a lot of work to do on. We've got a lot we can do to improve that circularity. We've got down the bottom here a range of ways we look at the economic vulnerability. And really what we're talking about is what's the size of the value when we use a particular material, mineral, how much value is that associated with in the UK? So what sectors? And that's one of the really important points. We're not just talking about clean energy sector because this is a national assessment. What we're doing is looking at the UK, what comes in, what gets used and what goes out. We don't apportion between each of the individual sectors, except where we say, well, actually, we're looking at the uses and we look at the gross value added. So that's where we use economic data to say, actually, yeah, if we look at steel, so much steel is used in construction, so much steel is used in the automotive sector. And then that's how we start to work all of these things out. So I want to quickly work through some of these because the traditional approach is you take a minimum value for economic vulnerability and a minimum value for supply risk up there. And that means that if we looked at the 2021 assessment, tantalum and tin, they would be critical, but things like germanium and nickel would not. If we take a risk management approach and we think about that as, consequence times, likelihood, that'd be the same. All right, a high consequence, low probability is the same as a low consequence, high probability. So in risk management, that should really be treated the same, and that's our curves. All right. So if we go through and finish the maths, actually, we think this is a much more appropriate way to really try and work out and discern what really is critical, because ultimately, value here, the risk overall with nickel is about the same as tantalum and germanium. So that's really what we should be doing, and that's, I think, a much more appropriate approach. Now, Paul showed this, and there's always lots we could go through. We actually changed the scope. We moved from 26 elements in 2021 to 82 elements and minerals. Right, so we also included a range of industrial minerals. So you can see kaol and clay there. And again, doesn't have much risk associated with it because the UK is a very dominant exporter. So of course that's not critical for us because we actually export it. So, and you can see, our threshold there, and that's subjective. That's a choice we make about the balance of where things go. So we can see iron here, we can see nickel, PGEs up there. Palladium's just out, which is a bit odd, but that's just a function of the data. All right. So if we compare the different lists, we can look at the position of things like iron and nickel and copper. One of the concerns is that why isn't copper critical? We use copper in so much. It's in our grid, it's in our homes, it's in our phones, it's in increasingly in our EVs, as Paul showed. And that's because copper is well supplied. Globally at the moment, copper is well supplied. And so it plots further down on our supply risk, and it has significant value, but it's below our threshold. Now, there are future concerns about the ability of copper to grow to meet the demands for net zero, but that's a future issue. And that's something that I suppose is not the way we do, we crunch all our numbers. We're looking at the period 2018 to 2022 here. But what's curious, if you look at the EU, the positioning is about the same for things like iron, nickel, copper. And again, because we're looking at it from a risk management point of view, iron, although it's very well supplied, actually is quite critical for the UK. Right. And so PGE is obviously UK very different to say the EU. These are just looking at our criticality plot, looking at different technologies. So what materials make up different technologies? We can see there's still many things that aren't listed as critical. We could look at molybdenum, for example, cadmium. We could pick on the periodic table. We still need them. They're still essential. They're still important. Various ways to look at it. And this is just some technologies, not all. One of the other things we've done, which we're just starting to release the version of these reports now, and the final versions will be released in coming days, is our foresight studies, looking at the next 25 years and a whole range of decarbonisation technologies. So all up the top, so a lot of renewable energy, electric vehicles, and so on as well. All right, and we can see on the bottom here all the different elements. So quite a wide array. Now, what we're trying to show here is the simple message here is the bigger the bubble, this is the total amount we need by 2050. So the bigger that bubble and the square is basically what we currently use. So in other words, how much expansion in supply do we really need? So the bigger that bubble, the more expansion. All right, so i.e. the smaller the bubble, the less of a risk it really is. Now, what we've done, and this is the work led by my colleagues at BGS, Dr. Petrovrazzi and others, is looked at the scenarios, national grid scenarios around energy, and you can see the different elements and how they track over time. And that's that evolution of technology. Now, when you take those results and you start to say, like Paul was showing, let's look at the supply chains and let's look at the different stages. We can see the dominance of China, right? Whether we're looking at EV batteries or electrolyzers and so on. All right, and that's one of the grand challenges in the geopolitics we're going through at the moment is how to actually make sure we unpack all of that. So out of that, we've done, I suppose, the criticality assessment, the 24 assessment. We've looked at 82. Out of that, we've now listed 34. Many of them are relating to decarbonisation technology, but not just decarbonisation. Phosphates relating to agriculture, ions relating to all sorts of things. So, but again, lots of more work for us to do, and we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. So now we turn to Professor Sarah Gordon, who is the co-founder and CEO of Satarla Sustainability and Risk Management. She's also co-founder of the not-for-profit Responsible Raw Materials and the production company Critical Productions. And she has recently been appointed Professor of Practice at Imperial College London. Imperial College, which of course has at its heart the original foundation in 1851 of the Royal School of Mines. So it's absolutely appropriate that someone with your expertise as a geologist is now at Imperial. Over to you.
I could pretend to be Emma, but I think rather than attempt to give her fantastic talk, I'll stick with my own. So thank you so much for having me here tonight. As a fellow of the Geological Society, it's absolutely brilliant to be hosting an event such as this here. Once upon a time, I was on council here at the Geological Society. I served my time. I don't know, maybe I have to come back again at some point. So with regards to the exam question that we have been set for this evening, so critical minerals, how can science and technology help to deliver the UK strategy? Well, I was really glad that I was number 3 on the lineup tonight, because I have to confess that when I looked at it, I thought, which strategy to start with? And thank you very much, Paul, for giving us that outline. As a member of that expert committee group that Paul said was really good, so thank you, Paul. Consider our arms well and truly twisted for later on. Of course, as you can see, this is something that is evolving. We had the first ever critical minerals strategy here in the UK only in 2021. And that was after the likes of COP26, so the big climate change summit that was held in Glasgow. It had been, of course, delayed by a year because there was something in 2020. I don't know. Anyone remember? I don't know. We all got to spend lots of time at home. But that was something where back in 2021, the connection between the wonderful world of rocks, minerals, metals, and all of that technology that is needed for the energy transition hadn't quite been made. At least it certainly hadn't been made here in the UK. There was one country in the world who certainly had made that connection. Does anybody know which country that was? Yes, it was indeed. It was China. And so one of the reasons why China has such a big pie, not just lots of segments within that pie, is because China was incredibly clever and put together its minerals strategy over 40 years ago. And they've done a fabulous job of enacting it. So what this means is, of course, as the rest of the world catches up, we've got a little bit of a decision to make. Do we play catch up with regards to that game? Or do we change the game itself? And I think this is part of the aspect that really science and technology and innovation and research and development, etc., can bring to the table. From a personal perspective, when I was first invited to stand up here and give this talk, my name was Dr. Sarah Gordon, and I ran a company, and I still do run a company called Satarla, which is a risk management and sustainability consultancy. So I could stand here and give us all a lecture on risk management. No? Anyone? Sorry, Gavin, just you. Okay. Or I can stand up here and talk about rocks. Okay, I'm going to do that one more time. Or I could stand up here and talk about rocks. Excellent. Well, I'm going to burst that bubble slightly because, of course, this is a discussion around both risk and rocks. See the illustration there? It works quite well, doesn't it? Now, Gavin took us through a fantastic overview of the critical minerals assessment, effectively. So what is critical with regards to what we need in the UK right now? So this is a pit of excitement that you can get stuck into. You can go and have conversations with people from around the world, and they will have arguments over whether their particular material is critical or not. And these are discussions that I invite you to go and speak to Gavin about, because they are scintillating with regards to what people are talking about there. But what Gavin, I'm sure, will say very quickly is it's not really about the past. What we're talking about is the future. So that's where these foresight studies, etc., really come into being. And the future is the exciting place that we can begin to think about, because that's where, if we say, okay, we understand what this game is, and the game is that we need lots of stuff to be able to live in the future, be it in terms of that energy transition technology, all the way through to things like ventilators. actually we are having to make decisions now as to where those materials go. They could all pile into batteries and wind turbines, or they could go into other things as well. So one of the reasons why things are critical is because we need loads of different bits of kit all around us. So the game is that we need lots of stuff. And also, just to really point at the elephant in the room, we don't really want to mine anything unless we absolutely have to. Most people, and I say this as somebody who has lived and worked on many mine sites around the world, because I started out life as an exploration geologist, and then I lived and worked on site. So I have been there, I have seen it, I've done it. Most people don't think that mining is a very good thing. And that's in part because they don't necessarily understand what is going on within that mining. I can feel the glares coming at me now. But I think this is a case, especially when we get into our discussion later on, it is a point that we need to be able to discuss. So in terms of the game, what can we change and what can't we change? So in terms of thinking about the future and those critical minerals that we need, there's really only one thing that we can't change, and those are the rocks. So the most important people in this room are the geologists. Get in. I can say that, can't I, Simon? Excellent. Okay, so what we cannot change are the rocks. We can change our understanding of them, our interpretation of the data sets, etc. But the rocks are the rocks. And as far as I'm aware, no matter who you pray to or what dance you do, the rocks do not change. I'm looking at Dan. He's there with his arms folded. He's thinking, well, maybe Sarah, if you think hard enough about it. So this is something here where we cannot change the rocks on the ground, but we can change, to start with, what do we actually need? And this is where Paul Gavin's assessment begins to crumble, because we begin to say, no, we don't need to make batteries out of that array of different materials. We could change what we put into them. And actually, we've got precedent for doing that. Things like platinum. So as Gavin said, when we saw things like Marikana occur back in 2011, people were worried about the price of platinum. Well, actually, Johnson Matthey's been doing an amazing job of working in that space, because what we've been doing is building a really great catalytic converter. That means we don't have so many nasty emissions going out into the atmosphere out the back of combustion engines. And we usually make them using loads of precious bits to start with. And then we go, whoa, that's a bit expensive. So we thrift it away. So we develop a piece of technology and then we improve it. And part of that improvement is by changing the mix of materials that we actually need to make it. So we can change the materials that we need for the future. We can substitute, and Gavin was already talking about some of that. In terms of recycling, at the moment, lots of what we call recycling is actually downcycling. So what we do is we take things like a car, we strip it, and we chuck it into the world of steel. Now, Dan, I'm going to keep pulling you out on this. Dan and I were sitting side by side at an event at the Institute of Physics a number of years ago, and we both almost fell off our seats because we found out that the chemical composition of the worst type of steel, i.e. rebar, contained 0.42% nickel and 0.31% copper. You pretty much open a brand new mine for 0.31% copper, and yet we're there throwing it into rebar. That's criminal. From a geologist's perspective, how dare we not respect the copper, etc., that we're just throwing away into that steel? Now, why do we do it? We do it because the steel industry, the scrap industry, survives on volume. So they don't have time to slow down and work out how do we strip things out in a better way. So here we have this conundrum of science and metallurgy, but also economics and market forces all clashing together to say, how do we revolutionize some of this? How do we change the game with regards to how we do it? We can, of course, change our behavior, but trying to persuade somebody to use less electricity is quite a tall order, especially when the entire world is trying to move forwards and develop. So how do we do this? How do we make these changes? Well, the answers sit with all of us here in this room. It's our expertise, it's our imagination, our creativity, but also our willingness to challenge one another. In this room, I'm sure we have people from all kinds of different disciplines. And the real magic happens when we get stretched and we're in that uncomfortable zone where we go, I hadn't thought about that before, but that's a really good idea. How do we try and capitalize on that particular idea? And where do those ideas often happen? They often happen on the fringes or the intersections of be it our sciences or our disciplines. And that is something that is very much core to the Rio Tinto Centre for Future Materials, which is, of course, my most recent addition to my personal portfolio of jobs. I'm still doing all of the other stuff, but it's okay. We're creating more hours in the day. It's glorious. So the Rio Tinto Centre for Future Materials really thrives on that transdisciplinary nature of bringing together social scientists, physical scientists, economists, etc., you name it. In fact, it's almost like the research equivalent of that fantastic committee that Paul articulated or described earlier on. And what's really exciting is once you begin to be able to speak a language that everybody can go, oh, I kind of understand what you're saying. Once we create that environment in which people feel comfortable enough to say, I think I'm asking you a bit of a silly question, but what does this mean? What about this? What about that? How do we find those step change areas of science and innovation? That is at the core of what we're doing. Now, this is only enabled by an incredibly generous gift of some cash from Rio Tinto to Imperial College. So this is a centre that is funded to the tune of 150 million over the next 10 years. That therefore allows us to take really big risks to say, well, what if we changed the way in which we utilize these materials? Or what if we totally changed the chemistry of that battery, or whatever the case might be? What if we changed the way in which we extracted those materials out of the ground? So we didn't necessarily need to dig a hole. It would make the miners really unhappy, but it would make the environmentalists and the social scientists very happy indeed. So we're allowed to answer all of these fantastic questions. So it's with that I think in terms of our exam question, critical minerals, how can science and technology help to deliver the UK strategy? It's about reinventing the game and saying, okay, fine, the mineral flows, the material flows at the moment are locked up, but how do we change what we need for the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Our fourth and final speaker is Professor Emma Kendrick, who is Professor of Energy Materials at the School of Metallurgy and Materials at the University of Birmingham. She's co-lead of the Energy Materials Group, and her research has involved innovations in the battery industry. Professor Kendrick, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm almost going to give you a case study of a technology and how we think about critical materials within that technology. Batteries. I'm a battery scientist, and to give you an idea first about how those innovations can impact how the critical materials and how we can maybe reduce the quantity of those in our battery technologies. Let me first introduce you to what a battery looks like. Now, forgive me for those that already know, for those that don't, we have an anode, and in a battery, it's typically graphite. Graphite is a critical material or a critical mineral. We also have a cathode, and the majority of our cathodes in the automotive battery is now a mixed metal oxide, which contains lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. Now, depending on if you're UK, US, China, or in Europe, everybody classifies their materials slightly differently in terms of their criticality. In Europe, lithium, manganese, and cobalt are all critical. And as you've already seen, nickel is actually known as a strategic material in Europe rather than a critical material because the supply chain risk is very low. Okay, so we have these materials. they're actually coated onto metals. We have a copper current collector attached to our graphite. We have an aluminium current collector, which is attached to our mixed metal oxide or cathode. Now, these materials are very carefully engineered, and as a material scientist, they're really beautiful spherical particles which are engineered to pack really well, put as much energy in as small a space as possible, whilst allowing space in between these particles to our electrolyte. Now, our electrolyte contains lithium to actually go into our electrodes and also go in between our electrodes to transport the lithium ions between the cathode and the anode. And then the lithiums go from the graphite to the cathode and electrons around the external circuit. So in this technology so far, I've already shown you a whole host of elements, materials that we've used, another periodic table, all of which of these are currently used in different battery technologies. But what I thought I'd do is just show you a bit of a case study on two of those materials. First, lithium. I'm going to talk about the European critical materials list because that's been around a lot longer than 2024. We can now start doing some of the analysis with the good work that's come out from the UK critical materials minerals list. So in the world globally, there's two main areas that produce lithium. We have Australia. Australia produce actually over 50% of the global lithium. The rest of it, or most of the rest of it, actually comes from South America, from salars or brines. And in these areas, the brine actually holds, or these lakes actually have pockets which contain concentrated bits of lithium in salt in solution. And what they do is they pump out the brines, the salts, and then evaporate the water off. And then you're left with these big piles of lithium, which then get exported around the world and then refined. Australia actually produces lithium from a lovely rock called spodumene, which is a great name for a rock. But most of the mining still happens in Australia, and then almost all of it gets shipped over to China, where it's processed. It's basically leached out of this rock and then sent around to the rest of the world. Now, interestingly, in Europe, we still get 68% or nearly 70% of our lithium from the salars, not from Australia, as via China, as most of that actually gets shipped to the US for some of their battery technologies. However, the cobalt and the nickel and copper is actually a different story. So we saw a nice graph of this earlier, but this highlights the kind of the very diverse supply chain routes that exist for these different minerals. Now, cobalt is actually typically a secondary element that's obtained from different ores. So copper or nickel ore, generally you can get cobalt as a secondary metal from it. Now, cobalt, almost all of it, 70% of the world's cobalt actually comes from Congo. Most of that then gets shipped again to China, where all the refining happens, to the rest of the world. Now, we're talking previously why nickel was a strategic material. The supply chain risk is a lot lower. And you can see that we actually have quite a lot of refineries for nickel in Europe. And we also have some mines of nickel and copper in Europe too. And this reduces that supply chain risk for these materials. So, what can we do about this? How can we improve our view of this sustainable technology and improve the actual sustainability of this technology, where we can reduce the amount of critical materials that are in these materials? We could potentially reuse the batteries or the materials within the batteries, and we can recycle them. This is a well-known waste hierarchy towards sustainability. So to reduce the materials, well, we can first increase the energy density. If we increase the energy density, that means we need less material in our actual device. We can increase the lifetime. Now, we need to start thinking of these holistically. So if you have a material that's actually in use for longer, you also improve that sustainability picture. So if you increase the lifetime of your battery technologies, you can also reduce the amount of materials that are actually coming into that initial value chain to do that manufacturing of your batteries. You could potentially substitute. And I'll show you some examples of substitution for lithium cobalt in a moment. We can recover those materials, reuse cells, reuse the materials before we can then recycle or recover the elements that are used within these battery technologies. So if we consider lithium cobalt again, we can potentially substitute these lithium for sodium or cobalt for iron. And if we look at the abundance of sodium, I noticed that the sodium materials are in the UK critical materials. It'd be interesting to know what that actual material was. It says sodium something or other.
Mostly soda.
Soda ash. Okay, interesting. You can also get sodium from seawater, and seawater is obviously globally available before you can then take it into the carbonates. Or you can substitute something like cobalt for iron. The only problem with substituting the sodium for the lithium is that you start to reduce the energy density. We reduce the average voltage. Sodium is heavier, sodium is bigger, so the energy density of that system will reduce. And in terms of iron, the global abundance is huge compared to the cobalt, and it's much more globally available. The cost is also significantly lower for both the sodium and iron systems. So to do that in a battery technology, all you do is simply substitute. You change your lithium for your sodium and your electrolyte. You can change your graphite for a hard carbon. And in doing so, we can actually substitute the copper as well for aluminium. And we can also simply substitute the lithium and the cobalt for the sodium and iron in these systems. And this is actually a new technology that's being produced by China at the moment as a new battery technology, which they are looking to put in lower range vehicles. So some final thoughts on recycling. So this is an example of a Nissan Leaf cell that you can see at the top. We're actually disassembling that so we can recover the materials, because a typical way of doing recycling for batteries is actually shredding. So you can see the same Nissan Leaf Gen 1 cell actually being put through a shredder. And all that beautiful engineering that you've done to create this amazing technology of a battery with all of these very carefully crafted components, you've now stuck through a shredder, and you have to try and reclaim these materials and purify them after putting them through a shredder. So if you could actually disassemble the cells and separate out the materials with less waste, then potentially this would be more economically viable to actually then separate some of these materials. So there's a question on innovation here. Can we actually design some of these battery technologies, especially these new battery technologies, for disassembly, designing for this disassembly process to recover the materials with less waste? Now, when we talk about substitution, we can compare the different types of chemistries that you will see in battery technologies. I've got here the nickel manganese cobalt that I showed you earlier. There is also a lithium iron phosphate technology, and I've got two examples of two sodium ion technologies here. You can now start to compare the quantities of materials that are in these different technologies and how that impacts both cost or value of the metal components within it, and also the supply chain risk associated with these minerals. And as you can see from the lithium ion technologies, graphite has a huge supply chain risk. And this is because 99.9% of battery grade graphite comes from one country, which you can probably guess where that is already. Yes, China again. And if we look at the value of these materials, nickel and cobalt and copper obviously have the highest value. So if you're recycling, there's an economic incentive to do so. And if you move towards things like lithium iron phosphate and some of the sodium ion technologies, which are lower value components, we need to find some way of being able to reclaim those materials. Because ultimately, what are we going to do at end of life? Where are they going to go? If there is no economic viable solution to recover those materials, what happens to them? And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Can I invite our panelists up to take their seats? It's a slightly tight bit of seating there. So I'm going to stand over here to chair the session. I think you're all just about going to squeeze in. Excellent. And I've managed to get onto my mobile the online questions, which some are coming on. But let's start with some questions from participants here in the room. Anybody here who wishes to ask a question? I see we've got several. Right. Let's start. Let's collect 3 interventions here. And if you give your name and organization, that'd be fantastic. Yeah, if you hold the microphone to your mouth, it may work.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Oh,
Yeah. So,
participants.
Peter Bonfield, University of Westminster. First of all, weren't they excellent presentations? That was really great. Sarah, you said you can't change the rocks. Also, you can't change where the rocks are. And I just wondered how much geopolitics has featured in the strategy and the plans and the thinking you have, because it's a rather lively world at the moment.
It's a very good question. We know the countries Donald Trump wishes to take over now. Let's collect a couple more questions. There's the gentleman behind you. Yep.
Yes, this is also to Sarah. Peter Dolan, I'm in the oil and gas industry. Yes, oil and gas rules, okay. As far as critical minerals are concerned, I've got 2 questions, Sarah. One is to challenge you on rocks don't change. In 1960, I learned that you have sedimentary, igneous, and guess what? Metamorphic. I understand that's a bit tongue-in-cheek because there's a time scale involved. But the second thing is, I am concerned, and I've been concerned for 20 years or so, about material science. We're generating new materials, which by their very nature are artifacts of science and technology. And within the biosphere, there isn't a natural means for their degradation. And I'd like you to comment on how much thought you give to that.
Right. Very interesting. And let's collect a 3rd question there. Yep.
Hello, Andrew Dobrzyński, University of Cambridge. So I think there was I want to say Peak Rare Earths that was interested in opening a processing facility in Teesside. Perhaps they may still intend to do so. But when I was I sort of cornered someone in the civil service and said, well, what are you actually doing to support this? Because otherwise I think they may have ended up being bought out. And of course, the reason given was we couldn't do anything due to the free market or the Treasury or something like that. So it's all well and good having a strategy, but how are you going to actually make sure that this gets implemented without sort of the Treasury saying no or something?
Right. Okay. Those are 3 questions. And then the next set I'll take from our online participants on Slido. So keep on putting in your Slido questions as well. Sarah, why don't we start with you? Several were to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for some fantastic questions. I think the first question with regards to you can't change the rocks nor where they are, absolutely true. Although just to lean into Peter Dolan's particular analogy there, with time they do move. Of course, there is that thing called plate tectonics. So thank you, Peter, for providing me with the tongue-in-cheek answer with regards to that one. So absolutely. And I think that vulnerability, effectively with regards to the availability of those rocks, is one of those key aspects that we have within this. When you're thinking about things like country entry from a mining company perspective, there are fabulous rocks in Afghanistan. But actually, there are very few companies listed here in London, for example, who would have that risk appetite to go to Afghanistan, for example, to go and take a proper look at what sort of rocks are there. One of my first jobs when I started working for Anglo-American many years ago was actually to go over to Luxembourg, where there were boxes of data with regards to the rocks in Iran, where Anglo had to leave. And of course, we needed to work out what to do with that data. So from a geopolitical aspect, very, very, very true. I think one aspect there as well, in terms of, so geopolitics almost provides a barrier to sometimes going into certain countries, but also we're beginning to see potentially rocks providing an enabler as well. I think to start with, when a certain leader in the world started talking about rare earth materials, we all went, what does he mean? Is he meaning the critical materials that we'll perhaps talk about in terms of the criticality assessments, or is he meaning the rare earth elements? Because of course we're getting a mix in language there. And also we all started thinking about our geology and thinking, well, where in the Ukraine is this stuff?
Yeah.
Enough said.
Right. Gavin.
Rocks don't change where they are, but we can certainly change which rocks we mine where. And I think when you're looking at something like rare earths, they're not rare. They're actually abundant, and they're actually in many places around the world, including in many mines that are already being mined. So I think there are choices we can make. And I think one of the things we're all struggling with at the moment is what is the sort of market conditions and how do we actually manage that? And that's something that's well above my expertise. But we could choose to mine rare earths in Australia, and we're seeing some of the new projects there sort of emerge, the new refineries and so on. Despite the 2010, export, I suppose, embargo that China put in place, we only got one new mine after that. But a lot of people sort of think, well, that's not very, very successful. But that mine was actually already in development anyway. So despite that case, the world didn't really do too much about it. And when you look at Mountain Pass in America, they mine, and the refining still goes straight to China. So these are some of the choices that we have to think through is, yeah, there are, rocks, they don't change where they are, but there are many rocks around the world that contain different elements of interest, and we can choose to mine in different places for different reasons and under different conditions, whether it's with different risk appetites, but with different ways. We look at benefit sharing and what standards and so on. So I think that's also an important part of the thinking.
Thank you very much. Emma?
Well, we're talking a lot here about primary ores, where actually part of the assessment criteria is about the recycled input rate as well. And recycling is really important. We can start using some of these components from cells as a battery technology or others as actually secondary ores to start producing elements from that to feed into it again. And we've already heard that actually the critical assessment, the materials minerals assessments, is dynamic. So if we can start doing more to recover the materials, to recycle them, to reprocess them, that will also improve where we stand.
Can I ask a totally idiotic question, which I think was sort of follows on from the intervention there, which is, are these materials now so hard baked in, there are no plausible biological processes that could do anything to extract the gas? When it comes to, say, plastics, there's a lot of smart people trying to design the right enzyme that will break up plastics or whatever. That debate is irrelevant for critical minerals. Can that be used?
Not at all. There's some really nice work going on up in Edinburgh, actually, which is looking at extraction of metals from batteries using bacteria and enzymes.
Yeah, so that could be a way forward. That's a synthetic, I'm familiar with that experiment. It is, so in that sort of potentially wider relevance, you could use those processes. Thank you for the question, sir. Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I've got another one along the line of rocks don't change. If you can't grow it, you have to mine it. Richard Harrington said that to me last week, and it's kind of stuck in my mind ever since as another one of those slightly truisms in this area. I think I'm going to pick up the question a little bit from the chat from Cambridge about HMT, government, and what government role is. I think when we did the first strategy and talk about that, we realised that many companies weren't aware of this issue. And actually having a critical mineral strategy, part of it was a raising awareness. Now, many of the defence companies do, because they have a very, very strong understanding of their supply chains. But many other people, major companies didn't have the same sense of understanding of the criticality of their supply chains around that. I don't think we should kid ourselves in this area that it's easy to get out of. What we've not really talked about is the numbers this evening, you know, the scale of this. And actually, if you look at in terms of material flows, I mean, it's you know, China is very, very dominant around this. So to the question about geopolitics, well, the whole question of substitution, in some senses, is a geopolitics sort of answer. If I can get out of using cobalt from the DRC, it actually gets me out of the geopolitics of that. The diversification of the supply chain, which you see in globally, but you know, from me discovering a rock on the ground to production in a mine is 10, maybe 15 years. You know, around that. So this is not something that changes quickly, you know, around this. So I think for me, there is a question of making industry aware, making sure that they understand it. I think what we're often saying in the government strategy is what can we in government with the levers that we can pull do? The Japanese stockpile. There's stockpile since 1973 and the oil crisis. We're not going to be able to afford to do that. So there are these, actually the American stockpile as well, for that matter, around that. So there are these different sort of responses that you can make. But the government's role to date has been to say, look, let's alert people to the problem. What levers can we pull on behalf of it that only governments can do, government to government work and the like, in order to be able to deliver that? The answer is never probably going to be financial support, you know, because the scale of it is just too large. But it's also a little bit in our strategy thinking about where we could play in the midstream more in the UK. You know, what is our role in the midstream? Can we set up the economic conditions to make that midstream viable, either through regulation or through support? So there are a number of ways that government can work. Sorry, David, you've got it. Yes.
No, and I think actually I was just going to follow up and just to check you agree, Paul. If you look at the industrial strategy, one of the 8 pillars is advanced manufacturing. And if you look at how the new National Wealth Fund will function, advanced manufacturing is one of the priorities for the National Wealth Fund. And they are explicit that they will look at supply chains behind advanced manufacturing. I don't think they want entirely publicly to fund these, but if some public investment with a swing factor that ensured a UK capability, it would be an entirely legitimate use of the one of the claims on the £27 billion in the National Wealth Fund. So I think that the strategic thinking and the financial resource is now behind some of the points that Paul has been making. Let's now collect some online questions from our from Slido, and I'm going to go for the 3 that have been upvoted the most, and I'll do all 3 together, and then we'll start at the other end. I'll start with you, Paul. First, what can UK or regional government entities do to actively join the Horizon Europe co-funded partnership on raw materials for the green and digital transition? That's by far the most upvoted question. Secondly, what is the potential for critical material technology metal recovery from old and unwanted electricals and electronics? What investments are needed in the UK? And then thirdly, a very high-minded question. We should get a bit ethical here. Research shows critical mineral extraction is linked to conflict and unrest. How can the UK avoid driving further conflict and supply chain instability? So 3 really great questions from our online participants. Paul, why don't you set the ball rolling?
Okay, so the last one, which Sarah's an expert on, is why we have ESG standards, is to avoid that very same thing. What we're working very hard at the moment is to, with a number of people at ICMM, is to reduce the number of those sort of standards around there. What companies are saying to us is too much of a burden on us as a company to meet all the different standards that were being set. So I think that simplification of standards helps getting things out of the conflict and unrest piece as well. And, you know, battery passporting, which is likely to come in across Europe, is going to have a look at that sort of, that ethical supply chain sort of question, because people literally don't want to buy products where you can track that. So there's a great demand for ESG as part of that. On the first question about Horizon, I think that what the UK government is going to do is probably put in £3.2 billion into Horizon in the upcoming spending review, or somewhere of that sort of order, because that's what the subscription demands over the next period of time around that, which will give a range of people, not only the critical minerals area, access to Horizon. So I think it's that making sure that the Horizon door is open as part of that. And finally, on the old and unwanted things, Emma's clearly the expert on this, but it's my favorite phrase. When you grind up those batteries, you get this thing called black mass. And I always thought it sounded very satanic, around this production of black mass. But there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way than grinding stuff up and then trying to extract it all again. And that design to recycle piece, I think that Emma talked about, is something that's really critical to move forward to. Why are batteries the shape that they are? Is a really interesting sort of question. It's a historical thing rather than necessarily a functional thing, I'm led to believe.
Bit of both.
Emma, over to, and while you're talking, Emma, can you just answer another puzzle, which is your fantastic imagery of the grinding up, breaking up of the batteries, and there seems to be the manual process of someone does something. I wasn't quite clear because it was all speed up. Were you saying the manual process was incredibly efficient or incredibly inefficient? What is the relative economic cost of the two processes?
So currently there is no economic way to disassemble safely. And I think safety has a big thing that we need to talk about in terms of recycling as well. There are examples of where disassembly is happening by hand, not in Europe, thankfully. There are some safety concerns around some of the chemicals that may be produced as you open the cell that then react with air that you don't want to come into contact with. So shredding is actually quite a safe way of doing it, because you can blanket the shred, you can take some of the gases out, you can control any reaction, particularly if you discharge your cell first before you then produce your black mass. But if you look at the disassembly, if we could design it so that you can start looking at things like robotic disassembly, where people aren't involved, you can start to separate out all the components of that cell. So then you have graphite, which just needs to be removed from the copper current collector. So then you have no impurities of any of your other elements in that. And the same with the cathode. You can remove the copper away from your cathode and remove the metal aluminium out. Because actually when you come to remanufacture, those impurities have a big impact upon the quality of your material that you're actually producing. So it has to be quite pure. So I think there's a lot of innovation that can happen in this space, particularly in looking at ways to design your cell to take it apart, robotic disassembly technologies, which we're starting to look at, and maybe also some more innovative bioscience as well to extract some of those metals. So lots of things to do.
Thank you very much. Gavin?
I think there's lots of things we can do. We can, and we forget that we've done some of these things in the past. Lead is virtually a circular economy because it was just regulation. Lead's toxic. We took it out of paint. We took it out of petrol. We just use it in lead acid batteries, and that was driven pretty much by regulation. You go down to your local supermarket, and it's really good to see here in the UK, as it was in Australia, battery disposal bins. All right, so teaching consumers that this is important to do. We don't want to chuck stuff into a landfill where you then get heavy metals out into the groundwater or things like that, and then have to employ consultants like me. So all of those things matter. So I think regulation. And people say, oh, but isn't that really hard? It's like, well, no, we've done it many times. We've done it with cars. We've done it with safety. We've done it with all sorts of things. We do it because it achieves the right outcome. So I think that's something we shouldn't be afraid of. We should say, how do we set the right regulation to get the right outcome? But the other thing also is teaching consumers. So that way they're educated. And I'm a great believer that when people understand the value in what they're doing, generally people will choose the right thing to do, whether it's conflict minerals, whether it's all sorts of things. So I'm an optimist in that regard, and I think we can get there. But so there's some of the key thoughts I always keep having in this space.
Thanks, Gavin. Sarah?
Yes, so I think to start off with the Horizon Europe question. So my company, Satarla, we're very much part of a Horizon Europe project that's about to come to an end in May. So we managed to fall down that gap of Brexit, where our European partners are funded by Europe and we're funded by UKRI. And Vector, which is the name of the project, brings together geoscience, social science and data science and said, okay, well, where might we be able to source these materials from within Europe? Now, one of the reasons why it's been great to do this based here in the UK is that we have phenomenal data sets. So when we're looking at different data sets to be able to say, well, where might you be able to find something? We've been able to use data sets, for example, up in Aberdeenshire from the British Geological Survey, all the way through to where are the roads, what's going on with water, what about biodiversity, bringing in satellite imagery to say, well, what can we actually see? And whilst, of course, Aberdeenshire is usually covered in cloud, I'm from up that part of the world, which means that some of the data isn't that great. We can always pull that together.
Right.
So I think from a regional perspective, actually here in the UK, we're a really interesting test case to be able to pull some of that together, much more so than many of the countries across Europe, actually. So they should come and be partnering with us for their Horizon Europe studies. Just very quickly on the recycling side, so Rolls-Royce make a lot of their engines to be stripped back. So this is something here where you don't need somebody exposing themselves to nasty gases, etc. They're making those engines so you can peel back those different alloys. Why? Because actually the material is worth a hell of a lot of money. Also, Rolls-Royce don't necessarily sell engines, they lease them. So this is something here where it's in their best interest to be able to pull these bits of kit apart. So there's a difference there in terms of the commercial model that we have. And then finally, with regards to conflict, I was a bit worried when Paul said Sarah's an expert on this. I've got what? Creating conflict. But absolutely, in terms of ESG, sustainability, etc., here in the UK, we have our corporate governance code. So that means that anybody who is here as a company actually is accountable to a certain level. And what that means is if we are working in the global sphere, actually, we need to be able to do things in the right way. Otherwise, we get into a lot of trouble here back at home. The Serious Frauds Office might fine us huge amounts of money, etc., etc. So I won't go into the delightful world of sustainability and ESG standards, but actually there's something very special that the UK can bring to the table, and that's in form of governance.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Now let's have another sort of questions from here in the room. And let's work through. There's a lady towards the back, Nick, closest to that microphone. Yep, there we are. And then we'll work forward. Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Gate from an organisation called AETO. So I'm just interested to understand to what extent you think there are opportunities for the UK to be able to obtain critical minerals in the future, either from deep sea mining on the ocean floor or, dare I say it, from space.
Well, thank you very much. Great. And then I think a couple of rows for, yes, here we are. Keep on moving that microphone forwards. That's it. Yes. Yeah, that's right. There. Yep.
Hi there, I'm Anna Morley from Arup, and I'm also the chair of the engineering group here at the Geological Society. So I followed your course, Sarah, some years ago now, so I kind of know your answer to this one. But my question is, can a mine ever be a good neighbour or a catalyst for positive social change and net biodiversity gain, either here in the UK or as a partner in the global south?
Can a mine ever be a good thing? I'm going to start with you, Gavin, on these, by the way. Right, then here.
Thank you. Nick Connor from Parisi. Earlier this month, the Henry Royce Institute published a strategy on material innovation, trying to, the whole point of it was to bring a strategy together to help the UK maintain its leading sort of edge into novel materials. I was just wondering, how do you see that drive of novel materials sitting with critical materials as an overall government strategy?
Thank you. And then finally here, yes. Right, brilliant.
Thank you. Andy Sellers from the University of Southampton. Are there opportunities to structure materials and novel ways, for example, through metamaterials, in order to change their properties and mitigate some of the risks.
Gavin, let's start with you.
What a great question. And I will do my best to give it a decent answer. Space is not about bringing the stuff down to Earth. It's space mining, from what I understand, is about using it in space for stuff in space. And that's fine. The biggest problem is all of our processes, smelting, refining, and so on, require oxygen or water, both of which are difficult in space, let's say. So there's a lot of innovation, a lot of work that probably has to go on to look at that. And where that goes, I don't know, but that's decades off, I would suspect, if, Now, for deep sea, and I have been involved in academic research in this, and we've just heard one of our papers has finally been accepted. How do you compare ecological impact from deep sea mining to that on land? And part of the problem is that we don't really have the data on land to validate a lot of the claims that and the issues that we really need to think about. Now, whether it's nature positive, I believe we could do that. I'm yet to be convinced that it's actually been achieved. Now, and I could go through lots of examples, but the direction is there, and we know we need to be able to do that. So now, when you're comparing land-based mining to deep-sea mining, I think one of the conundrums is just because there's problems with the way we regulate a lot of mining in many parts of the world, doesn't mean we should be jumping straight into the deep sea. Now, when you look at some of the numbers, and I've crunched these myself in the past, it's not going to be the game changer. Right? It may be a useful supply for nickel and cobalt. It's not going to be the big supply that people often claim it's going to be. Now, whether that's an appropriate or ethical supply, that's a very loaded question. All right, that's where I'll have to leave that open, because I'm still agnostic myself. All right, but that's one of the problems, is how do we actually really compare? And they're really chalk and cheese. So hopefully that gives you at least my thinking anyway.
Thank you very much. Now, Sarah, especially for those of us who haven't had the benefits of being your student so far, do you want to give your answers, particularly to answer that question about whether a mine can ever be good?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very, very much for that question. So absolutely, a mine can be good. In fact, a mine is almost a development project. So if we take that package of land where those rocks are based, so to start with, exactly as Gavin said earlier on, you don't get those rocks in isolation. So you're not just going to have copper in the ground. There are going to be other bits and pieces. So actually understanding what else is there, but not just the rocks. What about what's on top of the rocks? So the soil, agriculture, trees, etc., and then up into the atmosphere. So if we think about that package of land moving through time, and instead of just thinking about this in a 1 year or a 15-year or a 50-year time horizon, what about 200 years or 7 generations, as First Nations people from around the world often refer to time horizons? It requires a slightly different ecosystem of companies to come together. Often in, say, for example, the Global South, the mining companies actually have to shoulder quite a lot of this organization, perhaps because the governance isn't there from a government perspective. So it requires lots of different organizations to come together to be able to do it. There are some good examples around the world of where that is actually happening, but it requires different forms of value to be attributed to it. So this is something that may not give you immediate financial value in a way that you might get with another type of mine. However, the social capital and the natural capital that you will get coming through it are probably going to decrease the potential to not get your social license to operate, for example. So there's a lot of different aspects that need to come together, but absolutely mining can be that driver behind massive societal development, and especially in a world where we're trying to achieve a just energy transition, mining is a sector that can actually deliver that in a meaningful way. Just very quickly on the other aspects, if I may, just quickly on those. In terms of different materials, absolutely quantum materials. We are so close to getting them to work at room temperature, and that is a game changer. We will not need copper in the way that we need it now, because we'll be able to use a totally different mix of stuff. From a biological perspective, yeah, maybe slightly terrifying, but we can roll with that. And then in terms of mining the deep sea or perhaps space, my PhD was actually in the composition of meteorites. I'd be delighted to speak about that later. But yes, the materials should stay up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Emma?
So I was going to talk a little bit about the materials and materials innovation.
Yes.
The UK has a huge very impressive track record of innovations in materials. Lithium cobalt oxide, which was the first cathode developed for a lithium-ion battery, was developed here by John Goodenough at Oxford University, just to name one. They also then looked at the other transition metals in it as well and patented that. And then
developed by the Japanese.
Yeah, because the UK sold off the patent technology portfolio. We could go into that. Maybe. So we need to keep
in Australia too.
We need to keep it here. We need to keep those innovations here and fund that innovation in that space. I think it's really key. Yeah.
Now, Paul, we are sadly running out of time. I apologise to people in the hall who haven't yet been able to put their questions and to our participants online. But it means, Paul, you can give the magisterial summing up in about 45 seconds. So over to you.
Okay, so critical minerals, I think we've heard tonight that they are critical. I think we've heard that we need to think about diversifying our supply chains. We've heard that it's really a socio-economic and technical problem. We just, in that last discussion, discussed the social context of this, as well as the economic context, which then tends to dominate, as well as hearing a lot about how technology will evolve in the future, and actually our understanding and use of these minerals will change with time. I think what you've seen very strongly is that there are problems, challenges, and opportunities in this area that make it quite an exciting area. And we sat really on a transition to not make the mistakes that we've made in the past in this area, and actually, in some respects, forge a future using science and technology to make mining, processing and exploitation different to the way that it was. And I think you've heard this evening all the different aspects that we could do to bring that. So to the question that the society did, can science and technology help deliver the UK strategy? Absolutely. Bigger, better, faster, cleaner, and more thoughtful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you to our four excellent panelists, Paul, Emma, Gavin, and Sarah. Excellent presentations from all of them. Thank you to the Geological Society for your hospitality here this evening. And next, we're going to move to the Royal Society of Chemistry, our other host. So can I invite Helen Payne from the Royal Society of Chemistry to bring our proceedings to an end?
I always get the fun part of the evening where I can, I was going to sum up actually, Paul, but you did such a fantastic job. So can I just say thank you so much to Lord Willetts for hosting our event this evening, also to Simon and Gavin for hosting on behalf of the FST and the Geological Society, our amazing panellists, and I've been really kind of invigorated by what you have said, be that of chemistry or geology. So thank you to Paul, Sarah, Gavin and Emma. I didn't quite get a chance to ask my question, which was, having spoken about critical minerals, what are the critical skills that we're going to need going into the future? And can I just do a big shout out on behalf of geology and chemistry that both disciplines need funding and both disciplines need to be taught at university. And we need to make sure that we keep that message to those that have to hear that and listen to that and when they make their decisions, because having strength across both disciplines is really important so that we can work together. And we have to solve these big challenges by thinking globally, thinking across disciplines. Interdisciplinarity is very important, also thinking across sectors. So it was good to hear about the important sectors, be it finance or be it about minerals mining or the technology and innovation. And we need all of that to come together to have strength for the future. So I just want to say, to prove there really is a link between geology and chemistry, and that is to invite you to our reception just next door. And for this event this evening, we've actually opened up the real physical link between geology and chemistry. So you don't have to go outside. You can actually go in that direction. And it's a little bit like going through Narnia, go through the coat closet. Please take your coats with you, by the way. And there is a door that links both buildings. And I just like to say on behalf of Simon as well, that Simon and I have been working really hard over a number of years to secure our occupancy here at Burlington House. And it's wonderful that we've been able to host a joint event and that we now have occupancy for the next 999 years for Burlington House. So just as you said, the rocks might not change, but they might move, and maybe over the next 999 years we won't be moving. But maybe that's more the geological timescale than a chemistry timescale. So anyway, I just want to keep making those links. So yes, please do join us next door in the Royal Society of Chemistry. I think we're in the library this evening, but if you follow colleagues that direction, please join us for a drink and continue the discussion and the conversation. So thank you.